I'm sure you've heard me say this before, but I'll say it again. If it fits, stick with it. Once you've worked to achieve your desired fit on a sewing pattern, extend its life by creating new style variations of it. It will save you time and give you great pleasure when you see the end results. If you happened to watch last week's video, you'll know I recently made this jumpsuit. Since it turned out so well, I wanted to use it again to make a super comfy pair of floaty pants. So this week, I'm sharing exactly how I did that. I'm Alexandra Morgan from In-House Patterns and In-House Pattern Studio. I teach pattern making and fitting to people who love to sew. You'll find loads of pattern making and fitting tutorials at inhousepatternstudio.com that will elevate your sewing. Here's a closer look at the simple adjustments I made to the pattern to create these super comfy and floaty pants. Since I worked so diligently to make this sewing pattern fit me according to my body measurements and shape, I wanted to actually extend this pattern a little bit further and create some pants from this jumpsuit pattern. So what I've done is taking the bottom part of the jumpsuit, which of course is the pant legs here, and I have made some pattern alterations to the pattern in order to make pants out of this jumpsuit pattern. The first thing I did was determine where I wanted the top edge of my waistline to fit on my pant. Now I know that I want this pant to fit generally at my natural waist level. So what I did is, starting at center back, I used the waist level position at the back that was already marked on the pattern. Now I know from experience and knowledge that the center front height of the waistband is always going to be more comfortable when it sits lower than the natural waist. So what I've done here is I've actually measured down from the pattern here, from the natural waist position that was marked on the pattern, and I've actually lowered it by 3/4 of an inch. Now 3/4 of an inch might not be enough for some of you. Often I'll use 1 inch. Some of you might need 1.5 inches to actually make it feel more comfortable. But I like this 3/4 inch difference, and actually after sewing up the sample and creating this pant, I found that this was perfectly fine. So once I decided that, I needed to determine that waistline edge, like what that waistline was going to look like. So what I did is I simply layered my side seams together. So stacking my side seam up, matching the top edge here, and right along the seam line there. And what I did is I simply redrew the top edge of my waistline. So all I'm doing here is just putting my seam lines at the side seam. I'm stacking them up together. Once I've done that, I can determine the top edge of my waistline. And you're going to see here that I've got it outlined here in pencil, but I will sort of show you how I've come up with this. So I know that I wanted to go from this natural waist position at center back to this position here at center front, which is 3/4 of an inch lower than the natural waist here. So what I did is I simply drew a perpendicular line from the center front line like this. And it gave me a guideline to actually be able to start establishing this top edge of the waistline. I did the same thing here at center back, extending a line out from center back along that natural waist position. This helps give direction to the curve that you're going to end up creating. Now the next thing I do is I'm going to take a curve here, and this is just what we call a variform curve. And what I'm going to try to do, to my very best ability, is draw a line that meets both of those lines that we've just drawn. And I can see this is pretty close to what I had originally decided on here. You're going to notice here too, if you haven't already, that I've actually added the extra piece here because there is a pocket opening on this pant. I've actually added the pocket bag here, and that's so that I can get my entire waistline there. I'm just going to have to redraw that a little bit here. This is going to give me the top edge of the pant. Now, if you wanted to create a waist casing that was just a facing, you can absolutely do it at this point. But I wanted to create a 1-inch casing and a separate waistband for this particular pant. It just makes it easier for me to sew, and I just thought it'd be the best way to work. So the next thing I did is simply from that line, that's just the top edge of what I've decided my desired waistline position to be, I've actually drawn a line that is 1 inch below that. So all I've done is created a parallel line that is 1 inch below the one I just drew. And this is giving me the actual waistband seam line that I'm going to be using for the seam line of where I'm going to add my waistband. Once you've created your position of the waistline that you want to use for your final garment, you can then measure the waistband seam line position for you. Now, as I said, I'm going to be using a separate waistband, so this means that I am going to draft a brand new piece that is going to go on top of this. Now, I don't want to use this contour waistband for this particular style, simply because I don't have any darts here, and I know that this is all going to be gathered in. So it's safe to use a straight waistband, which is going to be my elastic casing. Now, the reason I chose to go down by 1 inch is because I'm going to be using a 1 inch wide elastic for my waistband. So basically, the distance that you're going to draw down from your waistline position that you've decided on, it's going to depend on the size of the elastic that you're using. So my next step is going to be to measure the back waistband seam line length and of course the front waistband seam line length, because this is what's going to give me the information in order to draft my new waistband which is going to be an elastic casing. Just going in to measure the back waistband seam line length, and you'll notice I'm measuring this line and not this line, because this is going to be the top edge of my waistband, which means that this is the line or the seam line that's going to be joining the waistband to the pant. So that's why I'm making sure I'm measuring this particular line. So measuring it out is going to give me what my back waistband is going to be. So it is about 10.5. It's just short a 1/16 of an inch. And then I'm simply going to do the same to the front. You're going to notice I'm measuring seam line to seam line. And this one is 10 5/8. Okay, so now I have the information to draft my waistband for these pants. The pant pattern itself now will be using this seam line. So when you retrace the pattern, which I'll show you in a bit, you're going to have to add seam allowance to this part of the pant. So in other words, you're going to be cutting away some of this top edge, and I'll show you my finished pattern in a little bit. When you lower the waistline position of a pant, you have to be aware of what other parts of the pant or the styling are going to be kind of altered by that change. So what you're going to consider here in this example is the pocket opening size. I can see here that compared to the original, the pocket opening has gotten quite small. So I want to make sure I accommodate for a change in this so that I don't have a too small pocket opening in my final garment. So what you can do to plan this going forward is simply take the original pattern piece that actually fit this original pattern here, and you can actually play with it and try lowering it to a point where you feel is going to work a little bit better. Now, I often use other pattern pieces to establish new styling lines. This helps me keep the designer's intent in terms of the styling of the pant the same, and you can use it as a template to kind of change it over. And you're going to see in a minute how I changed it, because I'm not exactly sure where I placed it, but I'm going to show you in a minute the front and back patterns laid up with the new waistline and pocket opening. So you can see here I've got the back pattern, my finalized pattern, laid up on top of the original that I used to create it. And you can see here that I have followed the seam line for the waistband here. and I've just simply added a seam allowance. Now you're going to notice here that I've used less seam allowances on this finished pattern than I did on the original. I used 1/2 inch here. This one was 5/8 of an inch. I just like smaller seam allowances. I think it's easier to sew them. But you can see how I have simply lowered the waistline of the back to accommodate that waistband that I want to add, which is going to land at the top of my natural waist here. Here you can see when I've laid up the front here that I've again lowered this waistline at the front. I lowered it by 3/4 of an inch, and then I reduced it another inch to make room for a waistband of 1 inch with an elastic casing of 1 inch. But you can also see here is an example of how I've changed the pocket opening to accommodate this lowered waist. So I have just changed that to a new styling, and you can see that it really mimics the original shape of the pocket opening. And I've got a really nice pocket opening, a really good size for this sort of floaty pant. The next thing, of course, that you want to do is draft the waistband forward. And as we said before, we measured that waistband seam line. And you can see here, I have actually measured it and made sure that it is the length that I need so that I can draft my waistband. And your waistband is simply going to be drafted as a straight rectangular piece. You can see here that my waistband is really just a long rectangle, and I've used the measurements that I've taken from the pant in order to create the right circumference for this waistband. I've decided that I want my seam line of my waistband to be at the side seam. So in that case, I've started here at this seam line, and I've drafted the measurement that I need for center front, which was 10 5/8 of an inch. I then go from center front to side seam, which is another 10 5/8 of an inch. Then I'm going to draft the side seam to center back, which was about 10 1/2 inches, and then center back to the side seam again, which is another 10 1/2 inches. So this gave me my entire waistband circumference. The width of the waistband is dependent on the width of your elastic. I'm using a 1 inch elastic, which means I need to draft my waistband at least 2 inches wide if I want to have a fold line at the top edge of my waistband. Now, I always draft it slightly larger than that in order to give enough room and space for the elastic and that turn of cloth that has to happen when you are creating a fold line. So I draft my waistband width 2 1/4 inches wide, giving me 1/8 of an inch on each side of the waistband to accommodate that waistband elastic. The next thing to consider is going to be how long to cut your elastic. So clearly this waistband is larger than your waistline, which means the elastic needs to be cut shorter in order to draw everything in. The length of the elastic that I use is equal to my waist measurement. So I measure my waist at 32 inches. I'll cut my elastic 32 1/2 inches long. This gives me a little bit to overlap the ends of the elastic so that I'll get the circumference, the final circumference that I need. Now, this may depend on the type of elastic you're using. Some elastic is quite stretchy and you may need to make it smaller than that. I usually use a pretty tightly woven elastic for waistbands, so this actually works really well for me. That finalizes the pattern work. Here's a look at the final result. Did you enjoy this video? If you'd like to see more like this, let me know. You can subscribe to my YouTube channel, message me via email at alexandra@inhousepatterns.com, or visit me on Instagram at inhousepatterns. When you comment, like, follow, and share on these platforms, you'll get more of what you love in your feed and help others to find the content too. Next week, I'll be sharing how I took the Lila sewing pattern and created yet another variation on the style by making it a tie front. I hope you'll tune in. I'll chat with you soon. Bye for now.